In this way, in 1938, the Jews built 38 new settlements, and did so, furthermore, with the assistance of their own British-approved police force, the Jewish Supernumerary Police. This body had been created, trained and armed by the British to defend existing Jewish settlements. In practice, it furthered Jewish interests much more positively. Indeed, many of its members were also members of the illegal Jewish underground organization, the Haganah. The supply of arms and the degree of military expertise in the Haganah rapidly increased. With deep bitterness, the Arabs observed Jews and British soldiers working together to maintain order. The British commitment to Zionism could not have been more overt, more offensively visible. But here, there is another paradox. This coalition of interests was itself more apparent than real. In London, the government of Neville Chamberlain was in fact rethinking the whole question of Britain's commitment to Zionism. The object of that commitment in the first place had been to secure British interests in the Middle East. But now that a major European war was looming ahead, the situation seemed different. It now seemed to the British that the friendship of the numerous Arab states in the Middle East was likely to serve their interests more than the gratitude of the Jews in Palestine. Chamberlain summed up the new attitude. If we offend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs. A major change of policy, to be categorized by the Jews as appeasement, was in the air. But again, in Palestine itself, and certainly to the Arabs, appearances were deceptive.
The British, throughout this period, between 36 and 39, had smashed the Palestinian organizational structure at both the political and military levels. Thousands were in detention camps. At any one point of time, there were at least 5,000 Arabs in detention camps. Again, the British resorted to massive collective punishment, destruction of villages, shelling of villages, bombing of villages, imposition of collective fines in kind and in cash, quartering of troops in villages and making the villages responsible for their upkeep. And by all these methods were tantamount to the smashing of the political and military structures of the Palestinians. That wasn't appeasement. That's my point.
The British wanted to change their policy in Palestine and adopt, in fact, a pro-Arab attitude, giving up the Zionist enterprise. They couldn't do that yielding to an armed rebellion. This would have showed up the weakness of the British Empire in 1938. And so a very large proportion of the British armed forces at the time, with the best military leaders they had, the later Field Marshal Lord Montgomery, General Wavell, they were all in Palestine at that time, suppressed the Arab rebellion quickly and efficiently, within a few weeks, in fact, in order immediately after the suppression of the rebellion to yield to the political demands.
And in early 1939, after the conference held here at St. James's Palace in London, the British were to make their concessions to the Arabs. The Jews, who met separately from the Arabs, saw at once what was going on. The British were going through the motions. The conference was a ritual. British policy had already been determined. This new policy was revealed in the White Paper of May 1939. It imposed severe limits on Jewish immigration and land purchase. And, subject to certain conditions, it proposed setting up a single, undivided and independent Palestinian state within 10 years. Partition had gone, and with it any hopes of Jewish statehood in Palestine.
The British then wanted to put forward a policy which would put a mutual veto on both Jews and Arabs. The Jews would be told, unless you come to terms with the Arab majority, you won't have any immigration. Immigration in the white paper of early 1939 was limited to 75,000 in another 5 years, in the next 5 years, and afterwards no more immigration, no more Jewish immigration without Arab consent. The Jews were told, in fact, you want Arab consent for further immigration, arrive at a kind of political arrangement with the Arabs. But the Arabs were told, unless you arrive at an arrangement with the Jews, no independence. This was put not directly in the white paper, but by implication. It was said that after 10 years' time, the idea was to give Palestine independence, and with an Arab majority, this would mean an Arab state of Palestine, provided peace and order reigned in the country. But if the Arabs didn't see to it that the Jews didn't rebel against them, then there would be no peace and order. If there were no peace and order, the British would continue to rule the country. And so you had a veto of the one on the other. Now, the last point in this was the very strong argument that was made out by the British government in early 1939 that a war was definitely coming, and that being so, the Arabs, if they rebelled even with ancient Turkish rifles in the desert, cutting British lines of communication, they would cause disproportionately big trouble to the British. And therefore, every effort had to be made to appease the Arabs.
The Palestinian Arabs, under the leadership of the exiled Mufti, rejected the white paper. It was nowhere near enough. There were too many ifs and buts. It was the Mufti's belief that if he played the right card, he could get what he wanted, and with no strings attached. In the early years of the Second World War, the Mufti of Jerusalem fled to Germany. His flirtation with the Nazis could not have been warmer. Haj Amin Husseini was backing a future winner, he hoped, one who would give the Arabs of Palestine self-determination and could be relied on to deal with the Jews. In Yugoslavia and Albania, the Mufti lent his prestige to Germany's cause by encouraging Muslims of those countries to form a pro-Nazi legion to fight in Russia. The British white paper, which had clearly not won over the Mufti, was even more overwhelmingly rejected by the Jews. To them, the white paper was a sellout, an act of cowardly appeasement. But still the Jews faced a dilemma. They were obliged to fight Britain over the white paper, but equally obliged to help them in the war with Germany. Ben-Gurion gave the Jews a lead. We shall fight the white paper as if there was no war, and fight the war as if there was no white paper. As the Second World War finally began, the predicament of the European Jews was a truly desperate one. In defiance of the restrictions imposed in the white paper, the Zionists began the organization of illegal immigration. The rest of the world, it seemed, had closed its doors to the victims of Nazism. In decaying, barely seaworthy ships, the Zionists struggled to save their fellow Jews. The British and the Zionists were at loggerheads. If caught, the Jews were not allowed to stay in Palestine. It was to continue so for the next decade. There was to be no more poignant illustration of the fact that henceforward British interests and Zionist interests no longer served each other. And in Europe, as the war went on, new and horrifying facts, solid evidence of exactly what Hitler was doing to the Jews, was coming to light.
The shock was traumatic, tremendous. The result of the realization that millions of family, co-religionists, co-nationals, call them what you will, are being murdered and simply won't be there anymore after the war, meant that something had to be done to redeem the situation. It is almost not a historical reaction, but a psychological reaction. The Jews came up with a demand, formulated in May 1942, for Palestine as a Jewish state. For the first time, this was openly and clearly advocated. No longer binational parity situations, but after what has happened to us in Europe, you, the free world, are in duty bound to give us the minimum, a national existence of our own. You cannot have watched us die in Europe and not help us achieve in this little corner of the world an independence of our own within a larger Arab federation. The Zionist proposal was to have a Jewish national state in Palestine within the framework of a Mideast federation. Fine, but we want our corner.
It was here, at the Biltmore Hotel in New York in May 1942, that the demand for that corner, that Jewish state in Palestine, was formulated. The setting of this meeting in America is as significant as the demand itself. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion knew that the Zionists needed new friends, new sponsors. For British interests and Zionist interests were by now diametrically opposed. It was, in fact, in due course, the support of the United States which was to make the achievement of a Jewish state possible. And it was the tragedy in Europe that provided the compelling argument. It was to be the decisive factor in the making of the state.